Last time on public space travel.
So I think for me, like, meritocracy, like the working hard thing, I think that there's an element of like you have to, unfortunately, like you have to like accomplish and achieve and do things, but like working hard doesn't equate to like success. Like there's also this incredibly nuanced like thing of like being lucky and also just being there at the right time, knowing the right people, being the right person, having like the right, I guess you could say, like socioeconomic luck background, etc. Like,
see, there's nothing lucky about having a socioeconomic like trump card. Like there's no luck. That's not.
I guess I mean like birthing lottery. Maybe that's what I mean by luck, or is still like not. Like if you're kind of like what Marx was saying, like I was just born white without my choice, and because of that I inherited benefits that I didn't choose.
Okay, new question. Would you choose something else?
Which one? Pick a race.
Oh my god.
Oh god, this sounds like a horrible. Never mind.
Yeah, no.
Just cut out that entire part. This is
public space travel. Public space travel. And so on and so on.
I can't help but believe that in the future we'll see throughout the world an increasing trend toward the next logical step. We'll achieve full communism.
Public space travel. Public space travel. And so on and so on.
Welcome to Public Space Travel, a podcast dedicated to social, political critique, comedy, and education, coming from an anti-hierarchy, oppression perspective. We aim for progressive, radical left solidarity with brothers, sisters, trans, and non-binary folk of all stripes. You can check us out on our Patreon at patreon.com/publicspacetravel. With us today is myself, Lazarus Wolf, and Luci.
Yes, hello.
Hunty.
hey.
Marks.
Howdy.
And our special guest, Charlotte, Professor of English and Education.
Hello.
So we want to discuss and examine topics or interview people that you want to hear about, as well as make corrections as to things we've said. Reach out to us at publicspacetravel@gmail.com or our voicemail at 208-502-1406.
So to the listeners of this podcast, we had recorded this before, and we had a really good talk and discussion over this issue. We felt like we wanted to take another stab at it for a number of reasons. One, just wanted to make sure that we were doing the topic justice and going over everything that we needed to. And I'm not sure how to describe the other reasons, to be honest. Like maybe you guys could put that in better words than me.
Well, I think that in our previous discussions, we maybe were centering whiteness in ways that weren't fair or good or just, and didn't make us very good allies and made us worse advocates for sort of understanding other humans. And so that for me, that was something that was kind of a big deal, just because I wanted to make sure that the right voices were heard, and the way we were talking about this topic best sort of reflected our views, my views especially, about whiteness and the problem of whiteness, and really centering whiteness as an issue. Like it's a problem. And white fragility is just sort of, it's a product of that. It's not its own thing. White fragility isn't something that like excuses behaviors. It's a product of this sort of cancer of whiteness, and I really want to make sure that we talk about it in that way and give rise to voices that might not always be heard otherwise. So
Yeah. Thank you.
is that good? Yeah, is that good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, basically, I like as the token person of color on this podcast,
Yep.
I was outraged in our in our meeting. So.
You don't look outraged, so I'm hoping that's a joke.
It's a joke.
But I am joking. But we did talk in subsequent conversations about really wanting to make sure that Luci had a chance to ask questions as much as he could. As that, I don't want to say you're the token person of color. So, from your position, like, how do we make sure that you have as much power as you want and need and should have in these conversations? And how can sort of white folks, of which the rest of us identify, how can we help to answer some of those questions and move conversations forward, hopefully progress ideas?
Yeah. And I actually do really appreciate that. I think like maybe that can lead into like the first sort of talking point that I was thinking over the past week was just like I've coming to terms with realizing that there's a lot of validation that I receive, or like there's a lot of times where I don't feel validated in the things that I'm doing unless a white person acknowledges them, like even in my work or something like that. It's like there's something about this weird thing in my head where I internalize the normal culture of whiteness as being the norm, where sometimes it seems like when a white person says you can do this or good job for doing that, I feel like yes, and I actually believe them rather than being skeptical, which I feel like should be the default, or like just, not caring at all probably. And that's just weird. That's just a weird feeling to have, and a weird thing to think about, and a weird thing to notice. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I think that shows that whiteness is a system that we all live in. And that there's an element of power internalized that we all internalize and live in. And so I think that like your feeling that way is a symptom of this sort of system, and that we've all internalized that. And I think that's what Robin DiAngelo, who's the critical whiteness scholar that we're drawing on for this podcast, she talks about the ubiquity of whiteness and how we all live in the system. And so it's not fair for one of us to say, well, we hear this like from white people, I'm not racist, so this doesn't matter, because we all do live in this system and are complicit in it. And so we all have to figure out ways to address it. Yeah,
that totally makes sense. I had another thought too about this too is like we had talked before about the importance, I guess, of white people calling out other white people, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit more because I wanted to know more like why is that important and what does that solve, things like that. If we could jump into that a little bit.
Well, I'd want to start with, okay, so calling out is one thing, but also just illuminating the systemic stuff that Charlotte is already talking about. I don't think enough people understand how the system functions. So, I mean, you can call people out as much as you want, but they're also a product of this system. So how do you illuminate the system? Like, how do you make sure that people can recognize that a system does exist, that they do benefit from that system, that this is how it functions for all humans who live in the American context? Like, this is not something that doesn't affect any of us. It affects all of us, and just in different ways. And so I think when it comes to whiteness, like critical race theorists and scholars have been talking about this for ages. Historians have been talking about this for ages. Like this isn't something new. I think that it just is getting new names. And so people are starting to notice it in different ways, right? And so when names have power, when you name something and you can start to see how that functions, then I think that leads to different, hopefully fuller conversations about this sort of thing.
So I was just teaching a group of 8th graders this morning, and this question came up of how we call people out or how do we address this. So it's kind of an interesting that it's coming up again. And these are kids of all backgrounds all over the country. And one of them was saying, well, you don't want to call somebody a racist, but you can say somebody has an implicit bias. And so how do we, but then this idea of like, people might be resistant. So then how do we go about that? And are those two different things? And are we letting somebody off the hook if we say you have an implicit bias? And so I think that you ask a really good question. But the other part of your question was, why is it important for white people to do it? And that is so important because typically white people are the people with power. And so we have to be the ones to address this stuff because we probably hear it too, like behind closed doors or in our families. And so it's absolutely necessary that the people with power recognize the power that they have and try to work with others. But I do think
it's not always going to happen.
Yeah. Oh no.
I had a really uncomfortable conversation with my daughter's basketball coach when we were traveling, and he used a word that I did not appreciate. And I said, well, why? He said, well, this is what that word means. And I said, well, then why don't you just use that other word? And you know what he invoked? Political correctness. I'm not going to be politically correct. Fuck. I am so tired of hearing about political correctness. I'm over this word. I'm over this term. I think everybody needs to stop using it. We need to care about other humans. And so,
I want the right to be able to say whatever it is and be able to offend anybody I want.
Yeah. What?
That's what he's saying.
No, yeah, it's absolutely what he's saying. And he basically said that. He was like, I'm going to say whatever I want, whenever I want. And I handled that situation poorly. Like, I think that...
You threw him out the bus?
What?
You threw him out the bus?
I did a little. I think I said something about... He was like, well, I'm gonna die knowing that I live my life the way I want it to. And I was like, well, the good news is that you're going first. So all the rest of us are going to change the world once you're gone. Okay, was that the right way to start to handle that situation in retrospect? Yes. Probably not. Right? I mean, but if we're going to have these conversations, if I'm a white human calling out this other white human, granted an older male human, like, how could I have dealt with that differently? And in retrospect, probably playing to something like, you are a leader in your community. What if you are hurting other people? That might have been a more effective way to have that conversation than invoking his death, which will probably come about in the next several years. So I just feel like so I just feel like maybe there are better ways to do it. It's really hard sometimes though, because I do put on that advocate hat and I'm like, nope. And I have to call it out. I was the only person at the table doing that. So I was the only person at that table. There were like 5 or 6 other adults. There were 2 smaller humans, like middle school kids. And I was the only one who had something to say about these deeply problematic things that this human was saying. That can be hard.
Did you feel like other people were agreeing, or were they like more so scared that this was happening?
I think they were startled because he's in a position, he's the coach, right? So he coaches all these girls. And so I think that they were surprised. I think that they probably just would have let it go, and he probably just would have moved on from it. It's just that that's not the nature of my being. And so I was like, nope, that's wrong. I have to say something about it. So I think that they were surprised. One of the other parents said to me later that she thought that I handled it well and she's glad that I said something. And that's what I hear a lot. Like, oh, I'm glad that you said something in that context, but no one else is going to do it at that time. And so I think that recognizing that that can be hard, but it's still important is also good. I don't know.
Also, you were speaking up for a group that you weren't a member of, and so you had the power to do that, which is really, I think is important in the conversation. But at the same time, you might have socially sacrificed something in that moment too, and so, but you were okay. Like we have to be okay with that.
Yep.
So, but I think that you bring up the point that like it's not always easy, and were there ramifications afterwards that you don't know about or do know about, you know, like, so it is hard. It's not like, I feel like I just presented it as like, we all have to do this and it's easy, because it's not.
Yeah. But if you recognize the system that we're talking about, and you recognize that we are all participants in that system, and you recognize that there is power to be had in certain circumstances, and you have to make sure that you vouch for others, I guess, to some degree, I think that that's really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's I mean, as like a person of color, like whenever like something like this is brought up in a situation, like usually like the situation will happen, and like someone like me or another person will just experience it, feel the like the pain of the moment, whatever's happening, but then just like internalize and go, it's okay, just wait till you get home, like it's fine, like it's like normal, or like you just kind of learn to. And I'm not speaking for all people of color here, even though I want to, but it's just like you get to this point where you feel like you just aren't allowed to, you're not safe to say something. And if you do, there's no way for it to come across without it being like overly dramatic or something like that. And
would you want somebody, so let's say that comment made by that older white human was something about you or the group to which you most closely identify. Would having me say something about that put you in an even weirder position? Like first ire is directed at me for calling somebody out for saying something that's dumb, and don't fucking do that. But then it's like, if it's about your group, it's like, oh, she said something that was is he mad about this? Do you know what I mean? Like, is that duplicate stress on you, or is that something that you would prefer have somebody, a white human, call somebody out? And do you see what I'm trying to ask? Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think this is like a personal question, right? Because I feel like for me, like I think I am like, I try to avoid confrontation as much as possible and try to find like the easy way out. But I think that in that case, I would just feel really good about knowing that I wasn't alone. But I think other people may feel like, why are you making this worse? Like, I was ready to just drop it, and now it's a thing. And I just wanted to go home and not have it be a thing. And I think that's just, I think it's very personal. That's something that I don't really have the answers to, and I don't know a lot about. Yeah. But that's something that I'm definitely like more curious in, like asking, you know, other people of color more about their experiences with that type of situation, or how, if maybe they haven't experienced that yet, how they would respond, or how they would feel. Because I do think that it's important for other white people to call out other white people in that way, because they have more power in that situation usually. Yeah. But also that it's tricky because sometimes there's like a matter of pride involved for the person who's being attacked, maybe, because like it could be, because sometimes, I mean, more oftentimes it's just like a microaggression. And so especially if it's like a male, like they might feel emasculated if they're being defended by a white woman maybe, and they're like, you know.
No, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure that was part of the conversation that I had, that I was an uppity white woman, but
was it?
No, I totally get it.
Did you say it like that? I picture like a Southern gentleman, like, this uppity white woman?
Yeah. Who does she think she is? Take her vote away.
She sounds like she needs a nap. Yeah, that's.
Oh, I was going to say, do you think that in some people of color might also see like a white person stepping in to kind of intervene? And do you think that there's like this issue of like a white savior kind of thing in terms of?
Yeah, I think some people would feel that way. I think some people definitely would feel that there's that. Like, I think there is some people who would think that, like, oh, you know, white people get too upset about the things that are happening to us. Like they just have to take over everything, including our pain. They can't. They won't. I've heard this before, where it's like we go through this every day, we experience this all the time, and then this one person sees it happening one time for us, and then they make it into this big situation, or it's almost like too much. And I don't know if there's a right or wrong way to respond to that or think about that, but I definitely have like had those conversations before too, where someone will be like, okay, white person, like you can relax. Like, I'm fine.
I cannot relax.
I think it's better not to relax. I think rage is better.
Too.
I think more people need to have more rage, because I think that my personal take is that for the majority of the time, like even with myself, it's like we are too complacent with the way things are, just in general.
Agree.
When there's like a consensus in the room, like when something like that is said and there's a consensus and it's not disrupted, then you just upheld the status quo.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I never want to step on toes, but damn it, like I'm not going to let something go. I cannot. Like I don't even know. I don't know. We talked about white guilt the last time a little bit, and I loved it because Charlotte was like, I'd rather people feel guilty than nothing, but it doesn't come from a place of guilt. It comes from a place of like knowing that the world could be a better place, and it's bad for some people, and that is fundamentally unright.
Yeah. Ugh. It's like righteous guilt in a way, instead of like I feel guilty because I'm cheating my diet. Like that's not real guilt.
Yeah, sorry.
Mm-hmm. I was just thinking, like, I've had moments in my teaching where something like this has happened and I didn't say anything, and then I like have that guilt, right? And then I think about, though, who did I harm in not speaking up? Yeah. Like, who was in my room that might have offended, who wasn't comfortable? So in subsequent times, I've tried to address it. So I think it is a learning process. And Robin DiAngelo talks about, she thinks of herself on a spectrum. Like, she is a critical white scholar. She's famous. But she talks about, like, her learning is still on a spectrum of, like, you know, she's not always perfect. She doesn't always do it right. But she asks herself, am I actively seeking to interrupt racism in this context? And even more importantly, how do I know? So she talks about, she says it's so deeply interwoven in our society that I always have to be asking myself these questions. And I think that's like helpful to think about, that we're not going to get it right every time. But
I'm going to really try hard.
Yes.
I'm really going to try.
Yeah. And that's the point, right? Is you try.
Yeah.
Because we're not perfect. We're human beings, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
And like sometimes I'm buoyed, right? So like what we talked a little bit about the new casting for the Disney's Little Mermaid, Ariel. Halle Bailey, who is a young black woman, was cast as the new Ariel in the live action Disney film. And so there's white Twitter who's like incensed, and I think the hashtag is something horrible that I'm not going to give credence to on a podcast. But then there are other people who are like, are you kidding? Are you kidding me? No.
Or like no as in I don't want her, or no as in
no as in like sit down, shut up. Like we're done with your racism. Like it's so blatantly obvious, and we're talking about the casting of a fish, which I think is problematic. I don't mind that people are using that argument, except that it doesn't speak to the system, right? Like the problem is that you people are racists, and you don't want a young black woman playing this character that you think is a white character.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it's your racism that's a problem. It's not the casting of a fictional character that's a problem. You were saying something earlier too about that.
I would just think it's so interesting that like this is how whiteness operates. It's so normalized, it's so universalized that until there's a moment when somebody pokes a hole in it, it doesn't get disrupted. So like now Ariel has been cast as a young woman of color, and everybody just expected it to be white. And like Robin DiAngelo calls that racial arrogance or racial belonging. How everywhere we look, we see white characters and white heroes and white actresses, and so we just expect that. And then the moment that it's not, everybody freaks out. And it's just so funny if you look at it from a different perspective. Like, why would you just expect that? Right, but that's how white.
There's no good reason.
No, but that's how whiteness works. It's
that's
this
the thing
normalization.
right there. There's an expectation of my world is white and everything I know is white, and it's so yummy. And now all of a sudden, here's this black person disrupting my whole view, my whole perfect world view, that everything that I do is the best and it's worth telling stories about. And now I'm upset, and now I can't deal. I can't handle. This is the first time I've ever been rejected. I can't deal with this.
And that invokes white fragility.
Yes, and that invokes white fragility. Yeah, for real.
So it's interesting. So in regards to like the Ariel being black and like this white Twitter like reaction, do you think that on one hand that like having Ariel be black is like good because people of color need like more representation, especially, or ought to have more representation in, for example, like Disney cartoons and such and so forth. But at the same time, this is kind of like the liberal, like maybe like answer or like a liberal solution to like deeper problems here.
Yeah, I think there's something there, because like my first thought like is when stuff happens, I go, okay, that's cool, but that's obviously them, pandering to a market. Like Disney they're not dumb people. Like they do their research, they know what's going to get the most money in their pockets, and having cast someone, probably any person of color, but probably stronger at this point in time, a black person in that role, like they know that that's going to bring in the crowd, because they see in Black Panther, they want them when they see the dollar signs, that's their ultimate goal.
And if anybody understands the teenage market, if there's any corporation on the face of the planet who understands the teenage market, it is Disney.
That because it kind of like ties in, so like with Pride, in the sense that things for like 1 month have like rainbows on them, and for example, like a group of people become a profitable kind of thing for that period of time, and then it kind of just goes away. We were just talking about Battlefield 5 and 1, like in the video game scene, they introduced people of color into the game where traditionally it would be white. And so you'd have like these World War I, World War II games where you'd have like black Germans, black Nazis, and you'd have like women in it fighting on the front lines, and some would have prosthetic arms and legs, whatever. And there was a huge reaction last year on the internet against that, saying that's not historically accurate. Stop putting like politics into games. Make it accurate, aka like we only want white men in these games. I
think that's part of it. Like there's like that, I guess, like white liberalism aspect too, where like if it was, I don't know if it was, because I actually didn't follow the story, but if it was, it sounds like it was probably on the white liberal perspective saying, we need representation. Just throw him in there. We don't really care about historical context at all. And then I go, oh, wait, we didn't do our research. We just felt, like we needed to show our power in this area.
Yeah, so same. And I want to know how many people of color were in the room making those choices. Do you know what I mean? Like that, I feel like is the bigger. So let's talk about the system. Let's bring it out a little bit. Like, were there any black or brown humans on the game design committee? Is it a committee? I don't know how they design games. But were there people in the room who were like, let's do that. That sounds like a really great idea. Okay, and this brings us back to the Ariel comment, right? Because there can be black Danish folks. There are black Swedes. These humans exist. They're just not in the room. Do you know what I mean? And so it doesn't matter if Ariel is a fish, really. It doesn't matter where the author of the original story came from, that he was Danish, that any of those, like, black humans exist, brown humans exist, people of color exist. And are you seriously going to walk through life assuming that everything you see is white? And that should be the status quo, or that should be the thing that we all, hope to be, or that we do gain more, or that we feel better when white people tell us that we've done a good job. Like, should it be that way? No, like categorically no.
And I think we read earlier that maybe this is Disney's effort to have a princess of color because they haven't had one in
the live action remake.
Yeah. Yet. And so I have to think, okay, so if this was their like liberal whatever, like, okay, I'm okay with that. Like, because I have so many students who tell me at the college level that they never saw themselves represented in texts that they read in schools until they got to college, or they never had a teacher of color. They never had a teacher who looked like them. They never saw, we can problematize princesses. Yes. Yeah. But I want kids to see, especially we talk about with critical whiteness studies, how young children learn about race and these constructs. And so I'm okay with them seeing Ariel as a young woman of color, like if it was a white liberal effort. Yeah. It doesn't fix the system, which I think is so important. Yeah. But it chips I see the system as have a lot of spokes, right? It's like a wheel with a lot of spokes, and this is one maybe spoke of representation. Mm-hmm.
I don't see those same people angry that there aren't any people from Africa starring in the live action of Lion King.
Right. or not understanding how people were upset about Scarlett Johansson representing the Asian character in Ghost in the Shell.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if you'll remember when Hunger Games came out, and Rue was black. Same sort of reaction.
Mm-hmm. Rue's not black.
Also Star Wars too. Like there's a thing about
I feel like anytime you see a character that's not white in a film, people are like, it's the immediate reaction.
Because that makes me think that when, for example, like black people are in movies, it's a black movie. But if they come into any other movie, they get that pushback against that. Like in the same sense that if Jackie Chan is in a movie, he can't be he can't be himself in a comedy movie or like a romance. It has to also be, it's a Jackie Chan film. Does that make sense?
Yes, and that is whiteness at its core. That every other film is just a film, and then a black film is a black film. That normalization. We don't
that's
label.
Super upsetting because I'm the same way where it's you don't see the representation. I think in the case of Disney, it's this is sort of in a way capitalism gone right, because that movie's not for me. I'm an adult. I'm still gonna watch it, obviously, but
I was gonna say what? Come on,
I'm still gonna watch it, but it's not made for me. It's not made for me. So it's the people, the kids, the children, they're gonna see it and they're gonna gain so much more from it than I will, and that's what's more important. And there's this thing because you don't see there was that case about in science fiction, you don't see a lot of people in color in science fiction. Yeah. So the idea that a person of color would be one, either into science fiction, or two, into a field like tech or anything STEM related field, it's unheard of. It's out of the norm because you don't see yourself in that position, so you're not going to do that. And then when there is just one single person in that role, people freak out and they're this doesn't make sense because you're not in your lane. You have to be away from my stuff. Yeah. Get away from my white stuff. So this kind of brings me to something else I was thinking about, and I'm trying to figure out how to segue into this. I wanted to know, ask you all as white people, about what percentage of time in the week, like in a regular weekday or week span, do you feel like you're able to like truly relax?
Well, I feel like you're asking the wrong group of people.
I want to, like, do you ever feel like you're able to ever truly, I know like we probably all have some type of like anxieties and stuff, but I want to know, like, maybe I can just go into the reason for this question.
Okay, yeah. Why do you want to provide context, or do you want to say? I want to answer for Charlotte and say 0% of the time that human works more than any person I've ever known in my life. Sorry, I shouldn't speak for you.
No,
though.
it's true. I was gonna say like a couple hours on Saturday, but not. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But that's because I'm like really high strung and a professor and.
Yeah.
Teach and have to grade papers and I don't know, but racially relaxed, maybe, is that like?
No, so I'll explain a little bit. So because the thing is, like, I've been thinking about this because I felt myself just never really truly able to relax, and talking to some of the people in my family, it just seems like as like a person of color, like there's just no time to relax ever. Like you have to work twice as hard. And maybe as women, you can also relate to this too. Like you have to work twice as hard to be taken even half as seriously in whatever field you're in, or even like for me, like even to have the basic luxuries of like my white neighbors and things like that. Like I still don't have, like, it's taken forever for me to be able to play an Xbox One, and I feel like that's crazy. And I hear like white friends that I'll have or meet people, and they're like, oh, like I'm on the new one. And I'm like, I didn't even get to play the other one. Like, I never had time to do that. And I know like this, I'm trying not to generalize here and just coming from my own personal experience, but it feels like when I talk to other people of color about something like this, it seems like there's this pervasive, almost like inability to find time to truly just enjoy oneself and being just being. And especially obviously in this day and age when you have people complaining about someone being casted as Ariel, or you have the American Gestapo marching down New York to round up brown people and put them in concentration camps. It just kind of feels like even if I do get to the point where I'm able to enter the next tax bracket or whatever, it's like I'm still not respected. I'm still not wanted here.
Yeah. I would like to thank you for calling them concentration camps. That's what they are. We have children in concentration camps in America, and I'm really glad you brought that up because that is truth. And as a historian, that is what that is. We have concentration camps. They are federally funded. Sometimes they're privately owned. Mm-hmm. It's wrong. I think that to some degree as a woman, I can relate to this as well. I think that as a mother as well, I think I'm the only one with children in our group. I think that as a mother, myself extends beyond me. Do you know what I mean? Like I have little duplicates of me for whom I am responsible, and it is reflected on me the way that they go out into the world. So I'm not only concerned about the way that I process my space, but also the way their spaces are processed, which is ridiculous. I have no control over that whatsoever. But like that's another sort of and motherhood in America is weird. Like the kinds of stuff we have going on and the way that people see how people are supposed to be, like the kind of parent I'm supposed to be. That's always really stressful because I probably do not fit in to most people's like demographic of like normal Betty Crocker bitch. Like that's not, can you tell? Like that's not who I am. And so
Betty Crocker bitch.
I mean, like, girl, I can cook. I'm not saying I can't, but also like make your own food. So there are just so many complicating factors. So yes, I feel like I can understand what you're saying about like never being able to relax. Also, as a woman in academia in this space, oh God, that's just a whole nother.
That's what I was gonna say. I feel like mine is probably gendered, but in unconscious ways.
Yeah.
But I appreciate your question because I'm not ever not relaxed thinking about my race. And I really appreciate you saying that because I haven't thought about that. Like,
I do think about it because of the work that we do, Charlotte, in schools and stuff, because I don't remember if we talked about the young man who was offended when we were doing work in a school. Did I talk about that? He kept interrupting a young woman of color, and like the fourth time, I was like, okay, so I would like to point out that this is the fourth time that you've interrupted this child, and maybe you could just like recognize that you're doing that. And I didn't. And it's one of those moments where like you have to step in and disrupt, because it kept happening. And even if it didn't bother her, it's his responsibility. Like, even if she was like, yeah, he does that all the time, it's his responsibility to recognize that he's already a young white man in this classroom space, and he's interrupting this student of color over and over and over again. Even if he thinks it's a joke, it's not funny. He ended up electing to not be in class with us anymore, and would actively tell people that we called him a racist.
I feel like he's calling himself a racist by saying
Yeah, I'm like, yeah, spread that story. That looks real good. Mm-hmm. But I mean, those sorts of things. So I do think about that a lot, just because, especially in spaces where I occupy, we have a question on an application for our program that asks students what race they are. Is that what it says? This is like race or something like that. And people write white. Yeah. And I'm like, no, that's not a race. Why don't they know that? It bothers me. Every time I see the application, it bothers me.
I'm pretty sure my grandma writes, I think I saw she wrote American.
Oh my God, what does that mean?
Wouldn't that be lovely?
What does that even mean? I don't even understand what it means.
That's what it means.
It means I eat apple pie and I sing the national anthem.
So your grandma is a Betty Crocker bitch. Is that what you're trying to say? Oh, please don't tell her I said that. She could be a pleasant woman.
I'm telling her.
So someone with a t-shirt the other day pulling in a gas station, and their back was towards me, and on the back of the t-shirt was the whole outline of America, and then inside it was colored with the American flag in there, and then it said, in the text it said, if this isn't your flag, then this isn't your country.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is really fascinating to me. So I think that when we talk about whiteness too, we really probably need to talk about it being an American context of whiteness, because it's different in other places. It's like this is a country built on the premise of whiteness. Period. Mm-hmm. And just like period and stop. Hard stop. That's how this country was built. It was built on the backs of people of color as a white space. Land was stolen. Mm-hmm. People were robbed, and then this this utopia was developed in which people were like, whiteness is the very best thing, and if these aren't your colors, then this country isn't your, or whatever. And from the very beginning, this country has been like that, which is fascinating, because a lot of other places haven't necessarily been built in those same ways as whiteness as the absolute epitome of good. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Places have tried to build other places like that. The British really did go in and try to, upend a lot of places. The French did it. The Dutch did it, in terms of because we've talked a little bit about decolonialism, mm-hmm. Lazarus, but it has never been built. Whiteness has never been built in the same way as it has, I feel like, in America. And so the system is as pervasive as it is because it has been built for this reason.
This is what I love about Megan Rapinoe. Is that how you say her last name?
Rapinoe.
Because I've been slightly obsessed with her in the past 2 weeks. But her message of exactly what you just said, we can't go back to a time that was great because it wasn't for everyone.
Yeah.
But that, even that phrasing is has whiteness seeped in it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And the fact that it was a slogan that got so much, what's the word?
Traction.
Yes. But that it seeped in whiteness in those normalized, taken for granted, under the surface ways is just fascinating.
It's such like a force. Whiteness in America is it's like an invisible beast.
Yeah.
You just feel it, and you see it everywhere. You just feel that, and it's weird because when I it's a weird thing, because when I meet anyone who's white from another country, I feel so much more relaxed around them than anyone from my own country.
Isn't that fascinating? We have some friends actually that we do a book club with, and they said the same thing when we were talking to them the other day, because they're currently in Europe, and they were talking about how much different they felt like when they visited France. It was like a totally different vibe for a black man in France than it would have been than it is ever in America. And France has its own complicated history with race. Yeah. If you look at like the French soccer team, they won, and that was football. The French football team, and they won, and that was a really complicated time in sort of racial dynamics in France when the majority of the team is from like Africa. But they consider themselves French. Like, they are French citizens, they are French people. And I think that there are divides in America that, I mean, like you could have been here generation upon generation upon generation, and you still feel unwanted, right? Like, you don't fit into that narrative.
So I was talking to my boss the other day, and he was telling like, oh, like, are you into video games? Did you get into that as a kid? And I was like, oh yeah, I did, and I still am. And he said, oh, I'm lucky he's like a much older man. And he said, I'm lucky I missed that, because what I did instead was I traveled and went to Mexico, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, that's nice. I was like, that's like,
wow.
I was like, even if I, was born at the same time you were, like, I still wouldn't have been able to do that.
Yeah.
Even less likely. So.
Dang.
There's a lot wrapped up in that statement.
There's a lot wrapped up in that statement.
And the thing is like, it's one of those things, but too, because like when he says this stuff, you're looking at him, you're like, he just has no idea what he's saying, and it's like, cause he's not like a bad person. He's not like, as far as I can tell, no like bad bone in his body, but like, it's just that like, the unawareness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But that's to me, that's almost the more, I mean, it's all dangerous, right? But like the unaware, like, I'm just continuing my day. I have good intentions, right? We always go back to intentions. Like that's the thing that perpetuates whiteness. I mean, that sort of lack of knowledge. Your comment about the American flag reminds me of, did you guys see Old Navy did a purple t-shirt for 4th of July? Because purple is the combination of red and blue. And so they were trying to bring like the political sides together to just celebrate the 4th. Of course, people were upset about this, right?
Upset about it because it's stupid.
Well, people were like, nobody wants a purple shirt for 4th of July. But also, it's like this attempt to, but again, like whiteness, this attempt to be like, can't we just all come together? Like, kind of ignoring this historic element.
Yeah. So do you know why we can't? So there was this 38.5 did 538, the statistics place, they did this like this question about bias, and Democrats think that like everybody who is discriminated against is discriminated against, but they don't think that Christians or whites are discriminated against. So they think that Muslims, immigrants, blacks, gays and lesbians, trans folks, all of those people are discriminated against. They're like, yes, absolutely, they face discrimination. Republicans are like, no, they don't. Also, blacks almost not at all. Also, they think that Christians and whites are both discriminated against in equal proportion to Muslims, or more to Muslims, immigrants, gays and lesbians, trans folks. So how do you make purple out of like the blue folks all the way over here being like, this is how discrimination functions? Yes, we know that. And Republicans being like, no. Also, blacks have it easy. What?
The context too, because really like white people have been getting trumped on the most recently, like in the past, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years. Like there's been more like public outrage against them on Twitter and other social media platforms and stuff like that. But it's only like within the last couple of years, not considering the hundreds and hundreds of other years that white people have had it really good.
Exactly. Like they have it bad now. Like there's something that...
And not even bad. It's just that now they actually like, for example, like they're like, oh, like now more people of color are getting offered jobs instead of me. And it's like, well, guess what? Like now you have to actually be good. That's what's happening.
Oh. Just a quick correction. It's an anti-discrimination campaign. The CEO of Old Navy said, our doors are open for everyone and for ideas and love and dialogue. So that's good. Like I'm on board with that plan, but just the glossing over.
Yeah. Well, but we can do that, right? That's why, to go back to even Lucy's very first question, like how do we call other white people out? Like, well, that's part of it, right? It'd be telling the CEO of Old Navy, white dude, right?
Oh, probably.
It'd be like bringing to their attention that a system exists and that purple isn't gonna like fix it or whatever.
Fix it.
Should we tweet at him like we did at Ryan Carson and be like, "Ayo"?
It's actually a woman.
White woman though? No way.
Yeah.
Shit, damn it.
Well, but the thing is, it pissed everybody. It pissed a lot of white people in power off to have a purple T-shirt. So, I mean, okay.
Yeah, I'm sure there were some, white terrorists who were like, "This is
White. Yeah, no, go. Yes, absolutely.
white ISIS," where they were like, "Oh, this is the queer agenda. You're coming for us in our stores."
Yes.
I think that white ISIS is just white nationalists, and I think that we can just call them that. Like, it doesn't even have to be a white ISIS. The white nationalists are deeply problematic.
I borrowed that term from Charlemagne the God, who says it often in his show, and I like it a lot.
Oh, that's awesome.
Do you think that this is like an issue of not enough people like knowing the history and thinking about, and maybe even like reading or seeing how? Because I could easily imagine white people in their whiteness bubble and saying like, yeah, okay, I don't really get the full context maybe of what happened then, or maybe they don't know about that. But even if they do, they're just like, yeah, but that happened then. Why am I to blame now? That's kind of like a conservative and alt-right narrative that's like spread. Do you think that if white people knew, and I really mean like knew the history more, and also like knew the generational effects that still persist into today, that it'd be easier for them to understand racism as something that isn't just like, oh, that's my grandpa at Thanksgiving. Instead, it's more of racism as a systemic or institutional or environmental, like those kind of concepts? Or do you think it would, and do you think it would also like potentially open the door to critiquing their own United States, like MAGA nationalism as a whole also?
I want to say yes.
That was a lot. Yeah. So
I the whole, I didn't own slaves, so I shouldn't be implicated in this. We hear that.
Yeah.
But then there's this whole concept of willful ignorance, of like people insulate themselves. And maybe it's not conscious, but so they don't have to know. But I want to say, Lazarus, like, yes, if people could understand that history, then yes. And I think and we talk about this a lot, like we have to go more at the systemic racism. We have to at institutionalized racism. So actually the textbook that I'm using this summer, it has two definitions of racism, one that it's individual and one that it's systemic. Mm-hmm. And I asked the kids, like, what does that mean? And there was like crickets. And so then I'm like, well, what are institutions? Let's start with that. And so I like give them an example, and they start naming other ones. I'm like, okay, so how can racism happen? But it's like, you're right. I think that there's so many people who that institutional structural level is really hard to grasp.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think like in some cases it would be like just like go to the south side of Chicago and just drive around there and see like how come this place is so starkly different when compared to the north side of Chicago, and start there, because that's like, it's almost like it literally is black and white, the difference between like what and then go like, why is this like this? And then you can start from there. And because I remember like I actually made some progress with my family. Like as I said before, I think on this podcast, like my stepdad he's half Japanese and half white, but he's white passing, and he definitely identifies as white. Like he acts like a white person through and through. And like he's the kind of person to say all lives matter and all that kind of thing. But when I had a conversation about Chicago and bringing up the history of Chicago and why the South Side is the way it is and things like that definitely got through to him, because those are hard facts. And that's because sometimes I think with humans, it's like we need to see like extreme contrast almost in order to truly grasp the nuances sometimes. And it's an unfortunate thing about us, because then it takes forever to get anything accomplished. But sometimes you have to like almost put it in that context, so that way you can finally go, oh wow, I feel the weight of this situation, or I feel the weight of this concept right now.
Yes. And complicity too, I think, is such a hard concept to grasp. Like, you might not be actively knowingly perpetuating a system, but if you are complicit, than you are, and that's hard to grasp and hard to know how to address.
And if I might also, like, I don't want to say that education is going to like save the day or whatever, but as an example, I just developed a syllabus that uses the People's Histories series. So like Howard Zinn wrote one, and there's a, you know, like an African-American People's Histories of the United States and a Latinx and an Indigenous People's History. No one reads those. Like growing up, like no one reads. So it's like we talk about the issue of representation in children's fairy stories. What about representation in the kinds of shit we learn about the United States history? Like we don't hear about all the horrible things done to other humans as this country was built and how it has been maintained. And that's problematic because that's what perpetuates these stories in the first place. Like you're allowed to think that these great men built this great country with these great ideals, and whether or not those ideals are real or functional or, you know, like practice as a matter of course for all humans. Yeah. No one fucking talks about that, not ever, and it's upsetting to me.
When I taught critical thinking, I opened up the course with reading Howard Zinn to like consider different perspectives, and as soon as I said that we're going to read People's Guide to U.S. History, this like, has anybody read Zinn? Only one person had raised their hand. It was this white woman, and she said, "Yeah, but I've heard that he's not even like a historian, or like this is, you know, like something along those lines." And I was like, it's.
And I mean, Zinn was sort of, you know, like, that argument that he's not a historian says who? What do you have to do to be a historian anyway? But I hate that argument. Go ahead, sorry.
But I think that discrediting is a strategy.
Yeah. Yes, agreed.
It's a discourse of whiteness, and it's like those, the ways that we construct responses that are defensive, that we rationalize. Mm-hmm. And there's been like a lot of research about how that happens in like critical multicultural education classes, like how people reframe those narratives so that, like, kind of going back to your other question, Lazarus, like how do we reframe so that we don't have to know, or that we do know, but how do we restore that cognitive dissonance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I definitely see, like, I study like some of the kind of the narratives on the alt-right and conservative side of things, and I definitely do see kind of an absence of considering and understanding history and seeing how it connects to today. And also I see some proponents, like some of the bigger names in the conservative and alt-right areas, who would say that that's like a liberal interpretation of history. So like in order to like, you know, like ameliorate, like, oh no, like don't listen to them, this is actually history. So you have like this, it's really like this cultural battle, but then it's like an interpretation of history going on in case they do look into the history so that they don't change their mind. Like,
no, revisionist history is what would happen if, you know, Lincoln had never been born. These are histories. There are multiple narratives of the United States past, as there are multiple narratives of the past of all countries. That, you know, the adage that the history is written by the victors or whatever. I mean, that's true in many ways, because that's why you don't have these histories exist. They're there. You just have to look for them, and you have to be cognizant of them. And for too long, it was allowed that that's not what happened. So old white men wrote old white history, and that's all we had to read. And I would say that that's still true. That's still true. I mean, you know what else is revisionist history? Textbooks in Texas, like claiming that, what is it, like Custer or whatever is a great man, or what, you know, I mean, like, oh, the great men of the great men of the. That's revisionist, to say that the people, is it the, you know, who fought for, you know, the South's independence were great men.
Nah.
So maybe this is a question for everybody, and maybe Luci in particular also. It's kind of easy to poke at conservative narratives of history, like this revisionist thing of history. Do you think that this still occurs from like the liberal like point of view? So I'm thinking of like Martin Luther King's letters from Birmingham jail, talking about the greatest threat being the liberal white moderates, you know, who don't act, basically. I'm just curious about that in regards to what we just talked about, this from the liberal point of view, kind of.
Well, I think like there is no objective truth. I don't know, it's like a radical thing to say. Like there is no static. static history or static, but we teach it in that way. So it's like we present the conservative narrative as like, this is objective. And then when we come in, people are like, you're being political. They're both political. So.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, no, totally. Because that's scary, right? Like, especially people think that kids can't handle some sort of like two separate ideas at one time or whatever. Like, they can't hold two things at once. And so they're like, well, this is our past. And then any complications to that can be sometimes startling, especially to fragile white humans, right? And so, or maybe worse, like people of color never hear about their histories, or it has to be like an oral history and not written down, right? Like it has to be like, oh, well, somebody told me once about this thing. And then that's not fair. That's not legitimately right or how that works. So I think that this idea that you can have multiple stories and that that's okay, and learning how to critique those sorts of things. Hold on. So I'm going to, whatever timestamp this is, I'm going to deviate for just a second and we can decide whether to use it or not later. So it's like, that's part of the reason why standardized testing is so detrimental to children's well-being and their learning, because they're learning one answer to a question as opposed to thinking up questions for multiple problems. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you question something if you're just supposed to learn the one thing? So is the answer A, B, C, or D? Well, the problem is that the question's fucked up. I want a different question because you're not thinking about all these other things that are happening. So I'm back on my education bandwagon, but I mean, that's part of that. Like, how do you teach children that there are multiple histories and that people are culpable and that there's still good parts, and then say, oh, but you just have to have the one answer? Like, that's hard. But I mean, like, in terms of your question, I think that bears weight on that to some degree, just because no, we're not revising. That's not what we're doing. What we're trying to say is there are problems, there are ways to address it, and these aren't the right ways. There are better ways to do that.
But I think, could a liberal write history in a way that can be critiqued? Yes, because it's a human being.
Yeah.
And a human being also wrote the textbook version. So yeah.
Yeah. Because the other thing too is like history isn't just made up of textbooks; it's made of people.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anyway, do you have any other questions?
I have a question about why white people be crazy.
What? Same girl, same.
We need to stop. How
you
do
know
we
what?
stop
There's an answer. They like the power. There is power and privilege in this skin color, and other folks really want to hold on to that. People will do crazy shit to maintain the stuff they have or the stuff they think they want. Capitalism.
Sometimes, like I saw a video where an older white man was yelling angrily at this group of people who were hanging out in a park and playing hand drums in the park.
Yes.
And he was just like, yeah, you're not real drummers. This isn't a real drum. This is annoying. And he's like yelling and waving his finger and getting in the girl's face and everything. And like, it was upsetting, but also just like, I was like, how are you so okay with embarrassing yourself as an adult in such a way? Like, I don't understand.
Yeah. There's like, how are you so set in your convictions? I don't know, but then again, people can say that about us. Like, I don't know. Yeah.
I think in some ways,
wrong though. If they said it about us, they would be fully like, I'm advocating for less power for myself. Like, I am outwardly saying, no, it's fine. Like, if I applied for a job and there was a person who doesn't look like me, they should have that spot. Like, that shouldn't even be
I know. I think because we are arguing for humanity, like human rights.
Humans, yeah.
So how are we wrong? But
it's another thing too. Is like I think about. It's like I wish I had that much conviction about anything in my life.
Yeah.
I wish I had that much confidence, just in general, to just go out and not behave in that way, but just to be so strongly convicted and not question myself. But I'm always questioning myself, like, am I wrong? Am I right or wrong in the situation? I want to consider all sides before I go through with this. So
that might be a better way to move through spaces, because I tend to be, even if it's for like the side of justice, I tend to be like that dude, only I'd be like, I'm gonna buy every everybody brand new drumsticks. I love what you're doing. You know, I mean, like that would be, so while I would have like, I wouldn't think about like that conversation with an old white man. Like I didn't think about what I was saying before I said it. And maybe I should have done that. And that would have, maybe he would have heard me. I could have made a difference and I didn't. And like, obviously that still kills me a little bit. Like, I wish that I could have said something to change his mind a little. And instead I said something that shut him down completely. And that isn't helping anybody either. Do you know what I mean? So maybe it's better to consider. It's just that how do you also find a voice? And maybe that's part of this, right? Like that was part of our conversation and re-recording is I want to make sure that Luci has as much time to talk and ask questions and critique in ways that make sense to you. That was so important to me when we were talking about this earlier about re-recording.
Yeah. And I think that like you raised a good point of like, he's protecting his ideals and like what he thinks. And he's so, and so I think it's, I think we do this thing where we like dismiss that as like insane, right? But then we have to think about, I listened to a couple of folks from Georgia last year present on like when we educate white students about this stuff, we are asking them to give up a piece of their identity. Like we have to think about what we're asking them to do. Like we're asking them to potentially alienate themselves from their family. We're asking them to give up like what they think they know or how they've been raised. And so like there is a bit of like conflict there. And that, so I think what Hunty just said about how we come at that, like attacking, or I had a professor who said like, or coming from a place of love, like genuinely, like I want you to help you see this, or I want to ask you questions. Like it's so hard to do that sometimes. Like, but like, how do we go at the old racist man yelling at the drummer? I think if we really want to get him somewhere, we have to think about how we come at him. And that's really hard to do because we might be angry, but like, what is our approach? And that's, I think Lazarus or Luci, you asked that question earlier about like, how do we do it? And I think that's like so important because if we shut people down, they didn't grow at all.
It's true. It's so hard because like some like it's just you if you experience it all the time, you get frustrated. And you just want to shut the person down. You don't really care as much about teaching them.
Well, and that's taking back some of your power, but then they think it's taking it away from them, and so, I mean, God.
And there are scholars that talk about like racial battle fatigue.
Yeah.
And this idea of like that it's exhausting, and you get worn out on like continuing to have to fight this battle, and so you have to do some self-care too, and some retreating and
massages.
Like massages.
Yeah.
And pick your spaces and your context in which you are going to fight the battle.
Do you want more or less whiteness?
Oh, boy.
Less. A lot less.
A lot less. So much less whiteness. Oh. I think this is... I'm glad that we revisited this, honestly.
I feel much better about this.
Yeah, me too.
I'm about to open my LaCroix without judging me.
We're judging you.
Brought to you by LaCroix.
Brought to you by Luci's LaCroix.
By Luci's LaCroix.
Oh my God! I'll make us t-shirts.
I like that a lot.
Yes, we'll be Luci's LaCroix. It'll be awesome.
All my LaCroix folk.
Love it.
Oh, so funny. All right, that's good. Is that good?
So on and so on.
We actually have an email from one of our listeners. David has emailed us and said, I've been really enjoying your podcasts as your discussions are engaging and relatable. Video games are an important part of my life, and lately, the narrative surrounding video games has been about the, quote, crunch period, where the managers of video game companies force their employees to work obscene amounts of overtime in order to deliver their video games on time. I see a lot of parallels between this practice and the practice of our economy as a whole before unionization and labor laws came into practice. I think that discussing this topic could lead to interesting conversation between you all. I think this question also lends itself to a segue of the topic of, is free market capitalism the best economic system? Anyway, love your show. Keep up the great work. David. Well, thank you, David, for reaching out to us. It's an excellent topic. We will absolutely get to that in a future episode. Anybody have any quick comments about that?
Just one episode? I mean, it's such a simple topic, but...
Definitely going to have to discuss it over multiple.
I think it's a great idea. I think we'll definitely be covering that topic for sure, David. And thank you for reaching out to us. That's awesome, because I didn't know anyone was even listening to us.
My mom really likes our podcast.
My
grandma says that it could use less swearing, but otherwise it's pretty good.
For real.
There was someone else who reached out to us. This is from Jonathan O., who writes on Apple Podcasts. Gives us 5 stars. Thank you, Jonathan. He says, great podcast. The hosts are relatable and do a good job of presenting both the issues and the humor and social problems. They do come from a left-leaning perspective, but that's what I'm looking for. I'm really looking forward to seeing where they go with it. I like to bounce between this and Chapo Trap House. So thanks, Jonathan, for that. Tell your friends.
Tell your friends. And are you Lazarus Wolf or PST Lazarus?
I'm just Lazarus.
No, what are you on Twitter?
Oh, on Twitter, I'm just Lazarus. I like the handle. I haven't got around to changing it. I'm lazy. Okay, I'll do it right now.
Wait, is Lucy at PST Lucy?
I'm PST Lucy, yeah.
Thanks so much for joining. I'm
consistent.
redoing it. Ready? You can cut, for fuck's sake.
It's just Lazarus.
Are you changing it or not? Are you not changing it?
I'm done.
Thanks so much for joining us today on Public Space Travel. I'd like to thank Charlotte, our special guest.
Thank you for having me.
If you'd like to catch up with us on Twitter, I'm at PST Hunty. You can catch Lucy. He's got some real smart stuff to say out there. It's at PST Lucy. Thank you to our wonderful producer, Marks. He makes us sound way smarter than we might actually be. At PST in the Shadows. And at Lazarus, the non-joiner. Our fearless leader.
It is actually PST Lazarus.
You bugger.
No, you said, is it Lazarus Wolf? And I was like, no. I'm not.
Did that just mess up the whole
No, you're good.
outro?
You're good.
No, we're done.
It's put it on there. It's fine.
music.
Public space travel.
Don't worry, buddy. You're doing fine.
Public space travel.